there is always that risk that we lose the good things when we're trying to build better things. And I suppose I'd be curious to know what you think that we're doing right from your perspective in healthcare, and where are our big opportunities to improve things for each other.
I think, people who get into healthcare are often some of our most motivated, altruistic people, in society. So you take people who come from that bedrock of wanting to serve, wanting to make a difference, wanting to help people. We take these by and large, those are the sorts of people who go into medicine, nursing, etc. And so we the substrate, if you forgive the term, that we're working with is good, and it's positive, and it's coming from a brilliant place. And so we need to examine our systems to understand what it is that means that people lose that altruism, lose that desire to go the extra mile, etc., etc. And I think, the three of us kind of know the environments in which we work, why those can leach away and disappear. But I think, I've seen over and over again, particularly in some of the work I've done with kind of dysfunctional groups or areas, or let's call it out, area pockets of poor workplace culture, bullying, undermining, that actually, when you work with groups that have got themselves into these really difficult places, when you dial back, they also were altruistic, hardworking, highly motivated people to begin with. But something happened along the way that has led to behaviors that are poor, a culture that is destructive potentially, and sadly may often translate into some really poor patient outcomes, etc. So I think when we work with groups that have got into trouble, it's about helping them almost dial back to where they were before, so that we can harness those original good drivers, and help them almost rediscover and reinvigorate them, and help them. So some of the teams I've worked with, by the time you are talking about bullying and undermining, and you're reliving some of the patient stories that you might have heard, or of some awful patient experiences, people are devastated and gutted to think that this is going on in their service. So there's often some very. I worked with a team about 18 months ago in my own trust, where they'd got themselves into a really bad place, and some of the patient stories were just heartrending. This wasn't a pediatric department; it was another department in my trust, and some of the patient stories were devastating to hear. And when we and there was a culture of bullying and undermining, which is how I got involved in my role as guardian of safe working. And when we relived some of those stories with the teams, you could tell that they were no less devastated to hear that, and particularly to think that it had sort of happened on their watch and in their department. And so helping them understand that actually you're not bad people. That the fact that this is happening in your department, we can turn this around, because actually we're all on the same page here. People come into work to do a good job in the morning. They're not coming in to behaving badly and bullying their juniors and ignoring the agony of their patients. And so I think my experience is that if you allow people to rediscover that, you can actually harness that energy to find some of the solutions that need to be found. And that doesn't mean you don't have tough conversations. That doesn't mean you don't address poor behavior. So certainly the particular team I'm thinking of, the clinical director had to take aside 3 senior consultant colleagues and have some very hard conversations about their poor behavior, and relinquish them of their educational supervision responsibilities, etc., etc. So I'm not saying we're all sort of soft and fluffy about this. There was zero tolerance for bad behavior. But how you find the solutions and move forward is about helping people rediscover their humanity, I guess, and what their original drivers were for doing the work we all do. And this particular example, it was a hard journey, and we made 2 steps forward, and then there'd be a setback, and then everyone would have to regroup and try again. And so these are agonizing journeys that clinical teams have to make. And one would hope that they wouldn't have ever got into that bad place in the first place. But I do believe we can find the solutions in amongst ourselves, even in the most trying of times.
It's quite interesting because it's almost like, and I see this in the work that I do with individuals and with teams, we seem to not understand the impact that we're having on the people around us. We kind of fall into our own little well of doom and despondency. We let that flow out. The people around us are impacted by that. And I sometimes think, no, I don't. I always think that the senior people who are doing this just don't recognize the corrosive impact that it has on the lives of the people around them. And once we help people to see how important they are as individuals, it's really quite counterintuitive, because I sometimes think that trusts want me to go in and give somebody a damn good shoeing. And I go in and I talk to these guys who think that they're totally unimportant in the world of their organization and that nobody listens to them. And you start building them up and saying, listen, this is how important you are to the people around you. What you say and what you do really matters. And they buy into that. And then if you can show them that behavior has an impact on team performance, they might choose to change. And, you know, it's kind of the opposite of what people want you to do, what organizations want you to do. In the first place, they sort of get wrapped up in the emotion of it, and these people are bad people. And you start hearing words like bullies being chucked around. And what you discover is a whole bunch of really distressed individuals who don't recognize the impact they're having on others.
Yeah. I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. And I think helping them understand that they're not bad. You know, I guess this comes to Adrian's learning from excellence. It's we're so hardwired to focus on everything that's negative, just as human beings. But you can then end up just going down this tunnel where that's all you're doing. And of course, no team, no individual is uniformly bad. Everybody's has done some really positive things. All teams have got things they can be proud of. But it's almost sort of trying to flip it around and say, let's just think about what's going well here and how we use the kind of energy that we can create from appreciating what's good to then build and address some of the stuff that perhaps needs improvement. So it's kind of flipping that narrative around. And as you say, you can literally see people's eyes opening as they suddenly realize, you know, we're not totally crap, actually. We are coming from we started off from a really good place here. We've somehow kind of, over time, it's all unraveled a bit. But actually, we can get back to where we were in terms of our motivations and our kind of desire to do well, both by the team, but also by our patients. We can get back to that place if we can just be given a bit of an opportunity to kind of rediscover our original motivations.
Yeah.
And I think that's where, for me, you know, in the world of, I'm very compelled by the concept of intelligent kindness. And this is where this idea of virtuous circle comes from. This idea that actually, if you can connect as people, if you can pay attention to each other, if you can be, they use this term, listen with fascination, so that, you know, genuinely pay attention to each other within the team, but also to our patients, that you can set up this virtuous circle. But if you read the literature around intelligent kindness, it needs a lot of energy to keep that virtuous circle going. It's very, very, very easy to flip into the vicious circle that we are all too familiar with. And so it does need that extra care and attention to keep the virtuous circle going. I don't think it's innate in us. We very, very easily fall into that kind of self-critical, negative way of thinking. I can see, Adrian, you're nodding your head, because this kind of is core to your work, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I recognize that completely, the fact that it requires a bit of work because you're sort of going against the grain of our natural approach to change and making things better, which is to focus on the deficits. That's partly, well, there's lots of reasons, well documented, why we think like that and behave like that. I think it's particularly prominent or prevalent in healthcare because we are in the business of identifying and diagnosing problems and fixing them. So we're already deficit based right from the start. A number of things that I wanted to come in on when you were talking last is one, I'm just going to float this for both of you to think about, actually, just coming back to talking to people who are behaving poorly through whatever definition we use for that, and it's having a negative impact on the team. And Chris and I, we've talked a bit about this in the past. I think any behavior from a subjective point of view is completely validated because you are behaving in the way that is right for you, and that it's justified by the conditions and the causes around you. So I always find it hard to have to show people, and I may also be included in this from time to time, that the negative impact of their behavior, because it is completely justified from their point of view. So I just wondered if either of you got any ideas for how to tackle that, or how to come at that, or whether you should just go for a completely different angle.
Camilla, I know this is you that's been interviewed, but do you mind if I answer this first? Is that all right?
Yeah, go for it. Please do. Please do.
Otherwise, I might just pop.
Go for it.
So Adrian, you were just talking about learning from excellence being used as a kind of change methodology through QI. I think the parallel within the sort of civility saves lives stuff is trying to help people to move away from judgment. When we take judgment into our discussions with people, we're making assessments of their character and their intent, which are almost always wrong. We're all the hero of our own stories. I know I say this most weeks, but I think it's such an important concept for me. So that if we can help people, we're not judging them, we're helping them to see the impact of behaviors and allowing them the space to choose to change if that's appropriate within their world. And I saw a lovely piece of work for one of the maternity units in Devon, where all they had done is tried to raise awareness of the impact of incivility. And what they did over a few months was they took the percentage of people within the department who were aware of the impact of incivility from something in the mid-70s to 100%. Now, I thought that might well lead to an increase in incivility as people recognized it and then said, I am naming that, that's what that is, because that sometimes happens. But what happened to them was that they went from a rate of incivility, which was people perceiving incivility over the previous few weeks of I think in the 70s, it came down to 50%. And it talks to me of a very hopeful idea that by understanding the impact that behaviors might have on the people around us, we can sometimes choose to change our behaviors. And I always hope that at the beginning of Civility Saves Lives, but I feel as though this is the first sort of piece of nice, simple, but impactful evidence that I've seen around it. And I don't think people normally look at that and look at those as metrics. And I'm going to use them again in future projects.
Chris, that's really interesting because I'm very compelled actually by something to, just to sort of back up what you're saying from my background as a South African, so nothing to do with medicine. You'll be familiar with the fact South Africa went through a long time of systematic and systematic racism and terrible treatment of huge sectors of society, and a huge amount of kind of bitterness and animosity between different factions within the country. And a man that I'm profoundly inspired by, who was the Archbishop of Cape Town, and a man by the name of Desmond Tutu. Now Desmond Tutu was important because he was pretty much the only influential Black person who wasn't in prison when I was growing up. And that was because he was a cleric, and I think they were frankly too frightened to put him in jail, because I think he would have been otherwise. And Desmond Tutu in a very thoughtful way, but in a very brave way, used to regularly kind of speak up about what he was observing and the injustices around him. But he talks and continues to talk about this concept of Ubuntu, which is something that I am very profoundly affected by. So Ubuntu is either a Zulu or a Xhosa word, which means I am because we are. So this is about the kind of humanity angle. This is about saying that we connect because we're human beings, and we are stronger when we are together as the kind of we are. And in fact, if you look across every tribe in Africa has a word that describes this idea. So this is something that's, profound, I guess, value within African people. Now, the reason I mention that is that from this concept of Ubuntu, Desmond Tutu developed this idea of restorative justice to try and bring some healing to South Africa after apartheid was dismantled. And he pioneered the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which brings me to why I think this is aligned to what you're saying. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission wasn't about saying you're bad, et cetera, et cetera. It was about saying, let's bring together people from opposing sides. So it might be a white policeman who had perpetrated violence on some black people and bring in the victims, but it might have been, it was all combinations of victim and perpetrator. Let's bring the victims of this and the perpetrators together to try and explain their lived reality and try and help them connect to understand the other person's viewpoint, and hence bring some form of restoration. And on the face of it, that sounds quite naive, but actually it had a profound impact, not just on the individuals, but on the kind of communities behind those individuals, because it started helping people to understand that you could find the language to identify with each other's kind of feelings and issues and realities. And so there was there was no blame here. This was about saying, help me to understand why you behaved the way you did, because in the spirit of Ubuntu, we are all in this together. And you see, it's when you start having conversations like that you can bring restoration, and people then do have a sense of justice. And so this, for me, the same principle applies in a way that you've far more elegantly described. When we identify teams where perhaps relationships are broken down, behaviors are not so good, you can apply the same principles to help them understand how they've got into this place, and then potentially what the solutions are for moving forward. So I think there's lots of evidence around that would support exactly what you're saying. I'm glad you've got your example from the Southwest, but I think you're absolutely right in your approach.
But of course, it's quite difficult, isn't it, when people, you said at one point there, I can't remember your exact words, but you implied that people would think it would be naive to think that other people weren't just bad, that it was naive to think that by getting into conversation with people that would somehow bring forward an understanding and a solution. And yet it seems to me to be the only way that we get to understanding. The only way we get there is by spending the time being vulnerable with each other, being prepared to listen to somebody else's truth and their world. And once we do that, we can perhaps they will let us share our truth. And then we understand the situation, but it takes time. And time is something that we feel consistently short of. And good grief, there can't be people who are more short of time, much more short of time than you, because you must be stretched pillar to post. And I wonder, how do you decide where you spend the time?
I recognize that challenge enormously, and I think this is what leadership's about, and I think this is what compassionate leadership's about. It's about saying, if we don't value these conversations, if we don't create time for people to genuinely try and understand each other's experiences and lived reality, we're never going to find meaningful improvement and change. We'll do a Band-Aid kind of sticky plaster type thing, but it'll come back. In a year's time, you'll be back where you are today. So actually, let's invest some time and energy and do this properly and thoroughly now, accepting that it will take time, and time is money in the NHS, isn't it? Or in any organization. So actually, and that's where I think you need the leadership angle. It's about saying, this is a priority. There is nothing more important than solving this, because actually, if we fix it now, we can move on. And then we've got a solid foundation, and we can be confident that, in 5 years' time, we'll be in a completely different and probably better place. But if we don't do it now, this will just keep coming back to haunt us. So I think that's what, for me, that's a substantial part of compassionate leadership. I think Michael West has absolutely got it right, and I've got his latest book, which I highly recommend to anyone who hasn't bought it, because there's some fabulous ideas and chapters, in there. But it does require those of us that are in leadership positions to say, hang on, this is important. There's nothing more important, in fact. Let's do it justice and take some time to get it right.